Good evening. My name is Harvey Bischof. I'm Vice President of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. We represent about 60,000 members, two-thirds of whom are secondary teachers, so members teaching in grades 9 to 12. The other third are support staff, education support workers who work from early childhood education, so in junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten, up to and including support staff in now 6 universities across the province. Our role as a union, of course, is to defend the rights of our members as workers. So, of course, we work to enhance pay and benefits and pensions and so forth. But a very important part of our role as well has been, always been, it's been part of our history to defend and enhance public education. It's what really sparked my interest in the union when there was an attack launched on us in the mid-1990s by a very right-wing premier, and our members insist that we continue to work for the betterment of public education in the province, and not just for, not only for those other things that arise out of their collective agreements. So I think my task here in about 10 minutes is to try to take you through what's been going on in the last 2 years. I will try to take you through chronologically, which means I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit between a couple of topics, but you'll hear the events, you'll hear the history in the order in which we lived them, and hopefully not in the same excruciating detail. I think that from what I've heard, their struggles have been not unlike what many of you have experienced. We have dealt with government's intent on imposing austerity agendas. We've seen attacks on public services. We've seen governments that want to legislate rather than negotiate, so they try to restrict our rights through imposing contracts and so forth. And over the last 2 years particularly, we've been consumed with a long and frustrating bargaining process. But none of this ultimately is purely a counsel of despair, because there is some optimism, and I will come around to that by the end at least. So at the last Tri-National in Chicago, I wasn't able to be there, but undoubtedly some of you were. We had, at that time, we had just had contracts imposed on us through legislation. It was called Bill 115, with the Orwellian name of the Putting Students First Act. And we opposed that in a variety of ways, and there were public demonstrations, there were actions that we could take to oppose it, and the kind of chaos that ensued out of that led in large part to the resignation of the sitting premier at the time. So while the government stayed in power, the premier stepped down, and there was a race to replace him. We also, in October of 2012, initiated a court challenge against Bill 115, saying that it had violated our rights to freedom of association, which are supposed to be guaranteed under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so we let the courts know that we would be taking that forward. From 2012 to December of 2015, that made its way through the system and was ultimately heard in December of 2015. So we had waited all that time, and then until about a couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, we awaited the judge's ruling, and I will loop back to that momentarily. In the meantime, the provincial government in Ontario passed a new law. This was Bill 122, the School Boards Collective Bargaining Act, and it created a two-tier bargaining structure in Ontario. There had been a kind of ad hoc approach to this for a number of years, because the sole funder of education, of public education in Ontario, is the provincial government. They provide money to school boards who are meant to implement the programs at the local level, but all of the money is directly tied to the provincial government. So under this new two-tiered structure, we would bargain big items, we would bargain monetary items and things that had a significant policy impact across the province at a three-sided bargaining table with government and representatives of the school boards, each on their own side, and us occupying the third side. And we had some hope that this new bargaining process, which would create a system that had been lacking for a number of years, would be of some assistance in getting us to a deal in a reasonable period of time. As it turned out, because of things that had been placed on the table, particularly by school board management, it was a very, very protracted round of bargaining. As I said, I'm going to jump topics a little bit, and I will come back and pick up the threads as I go. In June of 2014, there was a provincial election. So what had been a minority government lost the confidence of the legislature, so we had to go to an election. We saw a Conservative Party that had a significant lead in the polls as we approached that election, make promises, including firing over 100,000 public sector workers, which would have translated into about 10,000 education workers in the province. They were hoping that that was going to gain them traction with the voting public. They wanted to increase class sizes, decrease the help that we would be able to provide for our students. And certainly part of our message was to focus on why that party couldn't be elected. We worked with other labor organizations, and the Conservatives over the course of the campaign faltered significantly, and their message did not resonate with the public, we were happy to say. We were perhaps less happy to say that the message of the New Democratic Party, the more socialist leaning of the three major parties in Ontario, came out with a kind of pocketbook-focused and populist platform that really didn't engage voters very well, and they came out dead even in that election, but certainly didn't light a fire under anybody. So we were left at the end of that with a Liberal government returned to office with a majority in the legislature, but with a new leader who had had some history of being more friendly to education and to education workers, and it had, in fact had come up through her time as a school board trustee and had significant history within the education system. So there was reason for hope, not all of it yet dashed. We served notice to bargain in June of 2014. We got to the bargaining table in August, and the process was extraordinarily slow. The government certainly came with an austerity agenda and an attempt to flatline pay and other benefits. And the school boards came with a mass of strips and massive proposals for increased managerial rights that we had to oppose at that table. In a complicated strategy that was an appropriate response to a complicated bargaining structure that had been created through this two-tier program, we ended up with 3 locals in May of 2015 out on strike. So about 6,000 of our members were out on strike for as long as almost 6 weeks in the longest case. And the rest of the members of the organization supported them with enhanced strike pay, so they took less of a hit, certainly for being on strike during that time. And it was the longest strike that had happened in education in Ontario in decades, being out there for almost, as I said, almost 6 weeks. We had hoped that would under the government to bargain with us, and instead they went back to the legislature and imposed back to work legislation on those striking locals. But at least they didn't impose contract terms. They were sent off to binding arbitration, which is perhaps a somewhat fairer way of doing things. But that decision to legislate instead of negotiating was still, negotiating that to a conclusion was still, of course, entirely troubling. In August, we reached a deal at the central teacher table. We were planning action for across the province to begin in September, and the government had some desire, obviously, to avoid that chaos in the system, and so we were able to get to that deal. We were able to get to, over a three-year deal, some modest salary increases and some other improvements in other aspects of the collective agreement, including one that I think it's historic because it gave us for the first time within our contract clausal language that defended one section of teachers' professional judgment. And without going into the details of that, that's something that our teacher members particularly, have been demanding for a long time. It was critical that we defend their professional autonomy, and we have made some inroads into that for the very first time, and we thought that was important. What they weren't able to do is slash our contracts in the way that they proposed, so in the end, none of the strips that they had laid on the table, particularly from school board management, survived the bargaining process. We defended against every concession that they were trying to gain from us, and that is, it's not moving ahead, but it is a victory of sorts when you can hold back that kind of attack on our members. While that was going on, we then headed into a federal election, something that we don't generally get involved in very much within our organization because, as I said, education is provincially funded entirely. The federal government has less to say about education, much less to say, but we were dealing with a federal government that was launching attacks on labor in a whole variety of ways, and it was time for us to get engaged in that just to defend the rights of our members as workers, and so we did. Once again, we had a federal NDP in that case who also went for a kind of pocketbook approach to the election, did not ignite voters' interest, and we wound up with a Liberal majority government. On the upside, the Liberal government has reached out to Labour for the first time in a significant way that the federal government has done so, and the Prime Minister came to the Canadian Labour Congress, which hadn't been done in decades as well. So we see some hope there, even if our preferred outcome for that election wasn't what we ultimately reached. We continued bargaining on behalf of our support staff through into November, finally got a deal then. It looked very much like the teacher central table deal in terms of the main components of compensation and so forth. And we were working at the same time on all of the local deals that had to be struck in over 100 bargaining units, dealing directly now with the school board employers of our members. We were now getting close to a year and a half out from the expiry of collective agreements. We still haven't reached collective agreements in several locals. We have members up in the far northwest of the province who are on a full withdrawal of service 1 day a week. So 1 day a week they are on picket lines. Elsewhere they are withdrawing partial services but continuing to teach their classes. We're getting close now to the end of this round of bargaining 2 years after we began it. And to take you all the way back to where I began, a few weeks ago, we got the decision with regard to our charter challenge, and it was, I think to the surprise of many of us, certainly to the delight of all of us, it was a victory. The judge found very clearly that the government had interfered substantially in our right to negotiate, interfered substantially in our right to freedom of association, and declared that in his ruling unequivocally. What he did not do and was not asked to do at this point was rule on what the remedy should be. So we're now in a position where we have the opportunity to attempt to negotiate a remedy with the provincial government, or if that's unsuccessful, go back to the judge for a ruling. What's less helpful there is that the judge made some by the way sort of comments in his ruling that told us don't expect very much financially should you come to me for a remedy. So we'll see how that plays out. But it was a victory for union rights. It was a victory for our ability to defend our members' right to negotiate, and we see it as a source for some optimism. And with that, I think I've taken you through at kind of a high level what we've been through in the last couple of years, some good, some bad, but some light on the horizon as well. Thank you for your attention.